The Autism Research Institute relies on the generosity of donors like you to make this webcast possible. If you enjoy this presentation, please consider making a donation. Thank you.
Now, before we get started, I'd like to introduce our speaker. Vicki Kobliner is a registered dietitian and nutritionist with years of experience in applying a functional approach to nutrition. She develops individualized plans for clients, which are designed to promote wellness, prevent disease, and rebalance underlying nutritional impairments. A key element of her approach is the optimization of digestive function. Vicki has extensive experience in using dietary modification, appropriate supplementation, and functional lab testing to achieve optimal wellness. Vicki is experienced using gluten-free, dairy-free, low-allergen, GFCF, SCD, GAPS, FODMAPs, and other appropriate diets to reduce inflammation and promote healthy digestive function. She's contributed her expertise to www.gfcfdiet.com and worked with schools to develop a whole foods approach to student menu planning. She lectures frequently, both locally and nationally, on topics such as autism, special diets for food allergies and intolerances, healthy pregnancy planning, and choosing appropriate nutritional supplementation. She's appeared on television and video. Vicki is a contributing author to the books A Compromised Generation, The Epidemic of Chronic Illness in America's Children, and Essential Remedies for Women's Health. These webinars are made possible through generous donor support. If you'd like to contribute, please visit our website at autism.com. This mom is asking, I have a family of 5, I have 3 children and my spouse, and I'm never sure how to decide how much meat to cook, how many cups of rice. So what are some guides you can give us? My children are ages 13, 9, and 3.
Okay, so that's a question that gets asked often, and sometimes I think it doesn't actually get asked often enough. Most of us, because of the society we live in, tend to overshoot our portions and have an expectation, and kids need to eat a lot more than they really do. So I think it's important, especially when we worry about nutrition with our kids on special diets. We worry that they're not getting enough of something. We often overcompensate and expect them to eat a lot more than they really need to. So, for example, when you're first starting to feed kids, and I realize this family doesn't have an infant, but when you're first starting solids and in the first year of life, really we talk about like 1 tablespoon per year of age. So if somebody's going to be having, if a 1-year-old is eating some meat or some rice or some vegetables, really a tablespoon is enough per meal to get them started. Introducing those foods, and as they grow, the portion sizes get bigger. I would recommend, I have handouts that I give my clients on what is an appropriate portion size, but for example, for toddlers, if you're giving, for example, a starch, a quarter of a piece of bread to a half a piece of bread, depending on their metabolism and their size, is adequate as a serving at a meal, whereas we tend to think a child should eat maybe a slice of bread or 2 slices of bread. And if we're doing starch-free, if we're doing grain-free types of diets, then yes, we're going to move away from some of that. We're going to focus more on the fruits, the vegetables, and the meats, and we have to up those portions a little bit to compensate for the calories we've lost. But again, an ounce or 2 of meat at a serving is usually appropriate for a child, at the age of 3. Once we get into the teen years, we're definitely talking more about 3 ounces, 4 ounces servings at a meal. Vegetables are the place where we tend to underestimate instead of overestimate. So I want to see kids eating, a half a cup of vegetables at a meal if they can. And adults, certainly a half a cup to a cup per meal would be appropriate. And that's where we really want to focus our efforts, is on getting in some good quality protein, on getting in vegetables, adding to that some fruits, some legumes, some nuts, for example, if those are tolerated on the diet that the particular child is using. But looking at the portion sizes, and again, a tablespoon is like the size of your thumb. That amount of peanut butter, for example, or almond butter is appropriate for a young child, and 2 tablespoons is appropriate for an older child. So when it comes to portion size, we really want to, I would look up online some of the recommended portion sizes for the different age groups, but make sure that you're aware of those so you're not actually trying to either overfeed or underfeed in the different categories.
Do you know of any websites that are helpful for that, or what would they Google to find that kind of information?
I would just Google toddler portion size or teen portion size, and you'll get plenty of research about that. Now again, when it comes to what I'm looking at, like I said, I tend to make individualized handouts for my clients. When what you'll find is a lot of the traditional websites will place a lot of emphasis on grains. I tend to look at those calories, pull them out, and then up the vegetables, up the fruits, and up the protein slightly to compensate for those other foods.
Do you mean that specifically for the autism community or for all kids?
Yes, for the autism community.
Okay.
Well, for a lot of my clients with chronic illnesses, but particularly for the autism community.
Okay, got it. So emphasizing less grains and focusing more on those other things. That leads into a question here. Somebody is asking, she's saying that her child has been diagnosed with yeast problems, so candida. So she's wondering about carbs. How much is too much? What do they need?
In terms of carbs, well, there's a difference. I want to be really clear. There's a difference between carbohydrates that are starch-based and carbohydrates that are from fruits or honey or vegetables. So when we're talking about those two things, they're very, very different. In general, depending on what diet you're using, for example, a low yeast diet, very often the traditional low yeast diets will tell you that you shouldn't be having fruits because they're going to feed the yeast, and yet they allow more carbohydrates. However, on a diet like the specific carbohydrate diet, we're removing all of those starchy foods and we're actually making sure that we are incorporating things like fruits and honey, because kids especially do need some glucose, they need some carbohydrate to help their brains. So we don't want to pull out all the carbohydrates, we want to know the difference. The important ones that I tend to focus on more are the ones like fruit, natural fruit, definitely vegetables, some honey if we need a sweetener, something like that. And I tend to focus more on pulling out the starchy foods and especially the processed foods. So that would be my focus, is when we're looking to start an anti-yeast protocol, the first thing I'm going to do is start pulling out the starchy carbohydrates, the complex carbohydrates that come from the starchy foods. Cereals, bagels, muffins, pasta, rice, those types of things.
Okay, so that leads to a great question. This comes up at my house a lot. So when packing lunches, carbs are often the easiest and what the other kids are eating. So my son opens his lunchbox and he sees these other kids eating all these very carby, not much protein, that kind of thing. So do you have tips, not necessarily on besting the other lunches, but what are some good lunch ideas that families can put together that meet what you're talking about in terms of protein and sort of limiting grains?
Sure. So a lot of the things I start with are, and it'll vary by child because some kids are, as we all know, are very particular about their textures and tastes, et cetera. But one of the first things I like to do, and the stuff that I did a lot with my own kids, is use leftover dinner. And that was kind of a win-win in two places because I knew that the dinner I was cooking was relatively healthy. And it was meeting my kids' needs, and whatever they didn't need or wasn't good for them wasn't in it. And then I could make extra and just pack it up the next morning, and I didn't have to prepare twice. So leftover dinner is one of my favorite ways to pack a lunch, whether it's with a thermos, whether, if it's something warm, or it can be something, it can be something cold as well. Some kids will eat the food at room temperature. The other thing I do is think about where you start. So I always start with thinking about what's my protein source. It can be something like, a cut up sausage or a piece of chicken or a meatball, if that's, what you have and that's what you've made. It can be some deli meat if you want something really quick, as long as it's, good quality. And then I think about my vegetable. Am I going to give them some raw vegetables? Am I going to give them some cooked vegetable? Very often raw is really easy to throw into the lunchbox. So again, kids like things that are kind of portable. And if we start them really early, they don't necessarily think that this is something that they don't want to eat for lunch because their friends aren't. But carrot sticks, sugar snap peas, snow peas, green beans, celery, grape tomatoes, all of those things are great packed in a lunchbox. Then some fruit. And then if you're going to do something with carbs, again, it should be something that's organic. I tend to throw in something like a chip, maybe a potato chip, believe it or not, or a root vegetable chip, a sweet potato, or a carrot chip is another way to get vegetables in there without really letting them know. And And then I look at, do I want to throw some nuts? I love to throw nuts in there because they have a lot of fat, and fat is really good for satiety. It helps you feel full. So bento boxes are really awesome for sending lunches for kids, and they sell a lot of kids' lunch boxes that mimic bento boxes, where there's lots of little compartments for lots of different bits of food, and that's also really nice for kids who are a little bit more picky or want variety, because you can put some vegetables, some fruit, some nuts. You know, beans are great too, and you can either make, or there are companies that sell roasted beans that are salted and crispy and crunchy, so if your child's looking for that, it's a great resource instead of using the classic chip. But when it comes to chips, I tend to use something that's vegetable-based as opposed to wheat-based, and if it's corn-based, I always use non-GMO.
Okay, great. And one other thing I was going to add to that, we used with our son those little plastic egg carton, like egg holders. We used those like a bento box.
Nice.
They were great for little ones. It can be really good for preschool. They thought it was a big hit with his peers, and then half the kids in the class had to have that. So
that's great. That's an idea that I'd never thought of. That's great.
Yeah,
I'm going to use that.
There are good ways around that. We didn't have the bento boxes in our area, and they had those at the store, and I just grabbed one, and I thought he'd be embarrassed, but it was absolutely a big deal. So that's another idea.
That's fantastic.
Lunches, yep. So leading into, or following up on what you were talking about, I'm getting a lot of questions from parents whose kids have trouble with satiety. You talked a little bit about protein and nuts. So right. I've got some questions here from folks whose parents are dealing with issues where their kids are anywhere from 5 to 20. They're quite overweight. They don't have an off button, and they're dealing with, often they're very sensitive to textures. They're not liking veggies. One mom says she's become a very good sneaky chef, but it's not actually helping with any of their efforts right. to try to help their daughter lose weight. So do you have some suggestions, like family-wide, if you're preparing meals and you've got one family member who's dealing with these issues, what are some things that you can do so they don't feel stigmatized or left out? Have you dealt with that in any of the families you've worked with?
Okay, so I just got a little bit confused between satiety and stigmatized. So can you just...
Well, I think what we're talking about today is trying to make meals for the whole family, so you're not a short order cook. But if you have one family right. member who's struggling with these issues, who's on the spectrum, you want to make sure you're not making them feel singled out and they're on this right. diet. So how do you sort of balance the whole family's needs while helping this person, get to a healthier
right.
weight? Yep.
So one of the things I am a big fan of, every family has to find what is comfortable for them as a family, because if there's conflict in the family about how people are eating, it just makes more stress where we don't need any more stress than we already have. But in my experience and in my opinion, I do think it's better if the whole family eats like the person on the restricted diet as much as possible, at least in the house. My feeling was, at least with my own family, I would tell my husband, you can eat whatever you want when you're not here, but in my home, I don't want to cook twice, and I don't want my child feeling like our home is not a safe place. So those were two reasons why I felt like in the home, it should be consistent. The other piece was, if there were certain things that, my daughter or my husband wanted that were not okay for my son, we would keep it locked up, and it didn't really come out until after hours or a time when nobody else was around who might want it and couldn't have it. But I would cook one meal for the whole family, and I would try to find the common denominator. So, and then I would often make things in pieces. So for example, if we were going to have something like tacos, everything was separate. You'd have the meat, you'd have the lettuce, you'd have the tomato, you'd have the salsa, you'd have the guacamole, you would have the corn tortillas, and everybody got to pick what piece of that they wanted. And one of the things that is very important to remember is that, especially with the rest of the family, we have to focus more on our kids who are affected and make sure that their nutrition is really optimized. But with other kids, one of the things that is important to remember is, as a parent, our role is really to provide them with healthy food, to make healthy food and to present it to them at an appropriate time of the day, so breakfast, lunch, dinner, and a couple of snacks, at appropriate portions, so we're not giving them too little nor too much. And then it is really their job to choose what they're going to eat. And studies show that kids who are left to their own devices will self-regulate. And then after a while, if parents have not interfered too much, they will choose the right foods on their own. I mean, there are studies that show that kids have even chosen to drink fish oil when they got really depleted in omega-3s. What happens is the media messages, as us as parents telling our kids, you need to finish your plate, you need to eat this, you need to have one more bite of this before you get the dessert. What that does is it sets them up for thinking the dessert is the best part of the meal and the really desirable part. We don't want that. We want all the foods to be equal, but we want them to know that dessert is not necessarily something we eat all the time. It may be something that only shows up a couple of times a week. It's not required for a meal to end with dessert, and that we are presenting to our families lots of vegetables. And as I said, that's the area where I find the biggest lack. We tend to think of the vegetable as the side dish, and the meat and the starch, or the protein and the starch, are the main courses. And the truth is, the vegetable should be the largest thing on the plate. The protein should be next. The starch should be small, if it's there at all. And the fruits and the nuts and the legumes are also all things that can, replace the protein in some way, but also replace some of the starch. I like to see people eating legumes 3, 4, 5 times a week. I love to see them eating nuts at least that often. So what we tend to do is we tend to focus on too much the starch as the main part of the meal and too much of the protein. But my recommendation for including the whole family is just making sure that we have lots of different options that are available. So you give them the protein of the day, whatever the meal is, whether it's salmon or beef or chicken. You give them maybe an option of 2 different vegetables and a piece of fruit, maybe some beans on the side. Is there some starch there? Possibly. But then we don't force them to eat what they don't want to eat. Does that make sense?
Yep. Yeah, that's really helpful. So just, you're saying that one of the strategies a family can use is just have a lot of variety on the table, lots of things. And make
a lot of variety.
Yep.
Right, it's a balance. A lot of variety in that everybody knows there's always going to be a protein, there's always going to be a couple of vegetables, there's always going to be, a nut or a legume or something that's available if you want it. But that's it. If mom made beef tonight, she's not going to go cook up a chicken. It's beef tonight. If you don't want to eat too much of the beef, have a few bites and then eat the vegetables and eat the fruit and eat some nuts. So these are the things that are available. This is what mom has chosen, or dad, to make today. This is what you have to eat. It's your choice how much of it or how little of it you eat. But if you don't eat it, mom's not going to go make something else. The foods we present should be healthy, and there should be enough of it. But then we're not negotiating with our kids to eat another bite, another bite, another bite. They can choose to skip it. They might be hungry later, but pretty soon they'll learn it's good to try things.
Okay, so you'd suggest that during this adjustment period, so if a family starts initiating this, there's probably going to be some blowback.
Absolutely.
And so,
absolutely.
How have you seen families successfully? Have you seen some who have found strategies to navigate that using ABA, or they've used other ways to get through it?
ABA is always good. I think, again, depending on the functioning level of your kids. Discussions. Talk about, you can have A or B. Do you want a carrot or a green bean? You get to choose, but you don't get to not eat, you don't get to have a cookie instead. We can do, with ABA, again, when we're talking about kids on the spectrum, with ABA, one of the things I find helpful is the concept of, if this is a favorite food, and it should not be a dessert type food, but it's something relatively healthy. If you like the chicken nugget, for example, well, a bite of carrot, then a bite of chicken nugget, a bite of carrot, then a bite of chicken nugget, and try to alternate that so you get kids eating more of the foods they like less. But the other thing is to think very closely about, what does your child like? So if they like smooth foods, let's do a carrot soup or a broccoli soup instead of sauteed broccoli or a chopped carrot. If they like hard foods versus soft foods, maybe offer more of them raw versus cooked. If they like them cold, I've said this before on other webinars and people laugh, but my son only ate frozen broccoli for probably a year and a half. He wouldn't eat any cooked vegetables. He would only eat them out of the freezer. And the truth is there's no nutritional difference if they're heated or not. So I let him eat them frozen because it was, for whatever reason, he really wanted the cold. I know people who puree vegetables with some fruit, make them into popsicles, and let their kids eat them that way. So, and again, think about the crunchy. If somebody wants something crunchy, we may want to be doing more chips. Carrot chips, beet chips, sweet potato chips are ways to get veggies in that are a different texture. So it's okay to work with the textures that your kids like, the temperatures that they like, the visual, maybe they like things that look a certain way. It's perfectly fine to try to gear the food to their preference, but you want that, especially when it comes to vegetables, you want that food to show up on the plate and you want them to be eating some of it.
Okay. So the next question then, if we're going to go through this adjustment period, some parents actually experience hunger strikes where a child just won't eat. So right. In that situation, it gets complicated. You've got a lot of social pressure. You've got a lot going on there. So have you got any tips about what is an allowable amount of time if a child just won't eat? Is it one night? Is it a day and a half? Do you have any insight about that, or what you suggest to families if that happens?
So it's not ideal, obviously, and it's very emotionally painful to watch your child not eat. But when they have the flu, when they're sick, very often kids will go 2 days without eating, and they will survive. They will be fine. So I think that we have to steel ourselves to be prepared that that may happen. I think emotionally for parents, the most important thing is to make sure they have support. So it may be that you need to spell yourself and get grandma in or grandpa in or aunts and uncles to come in and maybe let you get out of the house for a little while, especially if you've got a kid that's throwing a tantrum because they're hungry but they don't want to eat. Sometimes the emotional support is all it needs to get you over that hump and for the child to realize that he or she is not going to get what they want, so they may as well start eating. Hydration is essential. So even if a child is not eating, if they're drinking, then it's much, much safer. You know, you can go many, many days without food. I don't suggest it for our kids, but you can go many days without food. You can't go as long without hydration. So making sure your kids are drinking is important. The other thing is there may be 1 or 2 foods that they do like and will tolerate that you can use. We tell a story about a child years and years ago that we had that we came up with a muffin recipe, and it had protein powder in it and vegetables, and it was a gluten-free muffin, you know, flour base, and we introduced it before we totally changed the diet, but the child liked it, and he ended up eating nothing but, you know, he would eat like 12 muffins a day, but that was all he would eat for about a couple of weeks. But he was eating, and he was drinking, and so we knew that he was getting his vegetables, his fruits, his protein, like we had it all in there. So even though it wasn't ideal, it worked. If you have a few foods you know your child will like, that gives you a little bit of a safety net, but they can go 2 to 3 days without eating as long as they're well hydrated.
Okay, so the next question I've got here, I've got quite a few questions about specific diets. So people are asking, okay, you know, we're not on a specific diet now, and how am I going to sell this to my whole family? Like, how do I promote this idea to everybody? So we've got kids on the spectrum, we've got kids who are typical, and how are we going to get everybody on board? So you talked a little bit about saying to some people they can eat whatever they want outside of the house, but in the house we keep it this way. Do you have any tips on how you've seen people successfully navigate that?
About navigating moving to a special diet, or just yep, navigating being healthier?
Right, introducing the concept of we're going to all be GFCF when we're in this house.
Okay. There's research. There's good, you know, anecdotal data. There's also some emerging research. And you know, if you're in any kind of support group, it would be really helpful to find somebody. You know, I give handouts to my clients about why the diet may help. There's a lot of that information online. TACA has a lot of good information about that. ARI has information about it. So if somebody is a data person, like a spouse, they might want to see some of that data that says this is the reason. For kids, you know, that's where it gets a little bit more dicey depending on the age of the kids and how much willing they want to be to help their sibling. But you can, number one, talk about the fact that when we do these things, we do them as a family. when we want to help our brother or sister. This is how it's going to help us all. I would also look at things like, if any of the other kids have issues. Do they have asthma? Do they have other, do they have digestive problems? Because very often in families, there's more than one kid who's suffering. Do they have eczema? If the kids have any of those problems, you can say, you know what? If we try this, then it may help your eczema. It may help this too. The other thing I do is always put limits on things. So not, we're going to be on this diet forever, but we're going to try this diet. We're going to try it for this long, a week, 2 weeks, a month, whatever it may be. And very often with the kids, you fudge the dates a little bit. You might say, we're going to try it for 2 weeks, and then Dad and I are going to decide whether we're going to continue. It's not necessarily their vote, but at least they feel like there's some finite point when they can reassess. And if everybody feels better and is doing better, then they're more bought in to continue. But you want to talk about how it's going to help the sibling, how it's going to help the kids. With spouses, you want to talk about what research is there and what data is there from other parents and support groups and what they've seen with this diet. And then you want to also give them rewards. So what are the benefits to the family staying on the diet? Well, there's nothing wrong with saying to a sibling who really is not on board, if you follow this with us and you're with us here, I know you really want X. And not something very expensive, but some sort of reward system for saying you've been a great supportive sibling. You've earned this reward because you've stayed on the diet with us for this long. But bottom line, as I've heard another dietitian say, who I respect greatly, at the end of the day, no child has the keys to the car nor the credit card. So the food that comes in the house is the food that is chosen by mom and dad. And so if the food that's in the house is what's available to them, ultimately they will eat it. Again, menu choices. Let's look at what a gluten and dairy-free menu looks like, for example, and present them with some of the ideas, like I talked about tacos. Tacos are pretty much inherently gluten and dairy-free if you don't add the cheese and if you use a taco seasoning mix that doesn't have wheat added. So you can look at even things like meatballs and spaghetti with a gluten-free pasta. Talk about how a lot of the foods really aren't going to change that much. And a lot of the foods you typically eat aren't going to change that much. So part of you wants to move the diet to a healthier place, but part of it is also showing that they may not feel it as much as they think they're going to feel it. And that can also help with some of the anxiety that surrounds diet change.
Okay, this is a big switch in topic, but I think it's important to ask. We've got a mother who's writing from Venezuela, and one of the things that they contend there are food shortages because of government issues.
Right.
So she has an adult.
The economy. Mm-hmm.
Yep. She has an adult with epilepsy and severe autism, and her son is having issues with oxalates and proteins. So she's asking, I know this is a little off topic because it's not about general meal planning, but she's asking if we can tell her some options for fruits and vegetables. He does not gain weight. He's very thin. And on top of that, they have this issue with foods. So do you have some suggestions about meals with vegetables that might work for her given their situation?
Wow. Okay. So the questions I would have would be around what food availability. I mean, it's hard to say what will work if I don't know what the food availability is.
Yeah, I think what she's saying is that mostly what they're going to have access to are vegetables. That
Fruits and vegetables.
They're going to rely on those things because they don't have protein.
And legumes are going to be a problem because of the oxalates, as are the nuts. So yeah, protein becomes a challenge there. And there are some high-protein grains that are also a little bit challenging in oxalates, but not all of them. So any high-protein grains that she has access to that are not high oxalate would be one thing I would look at. I would also look...
You just said they do have roots, meat, and poultry. So they do have those proteins.
Oh, okay. So if they have meat and poultry and eggs are generally, don't have oxalates.
Okay.
So that would be a good thing to do. And then really it would just be a question of looking at what the vegetables and the fruits are that are available and comparing it to a list of high and low oxalate foods and choosing the ones that are as low as possible. One of the things about oxalates is that it's dose dependent. So if you eat a lot of high oxalate foods at one meal, it's going to be much worse than if you divide it up over the course of the day. So looking at what foods they have available, if they only have access to some high oxalate foods, then some high oxalate vegetables or fruits, then I would try to give smaller portions broken up throughout the day as opposed to a lot of it at one meal. So again, the protein, a higher protein diet is better for the epilepsy. A higher protein diet is better for the oxalates, and carbohydrate foods are going to be the one that is not good for either the epilepsy or in some cases for the oxalates. The balance here, and I'm sorry I can't speak more specifically, the balance here is going to be about, generally a lot of like gluten-free type foods are bean-based or nut-based flours, and those are not going to be okay for the oxalates, so you really have to rely more on things like rice. But you want to limit that if you're looking at seizures. So protein, low oxalate fruits, low oxalate vegetables are what you're going to want as the bulk of your diet. And if you have to eat some things that are higher in oxalates, you're going to want to give smaller portions broken up throughout the day. That would be the best answer I could give.
Okay, so circling back to family culture, this question is about picky eating. So you've touched on it quite a bit, but let's talk about it sort of as the general concept of picky eaters. So not necessarily talking about it even in terms of autism, although this mom does say that she has a son who's 10 and he's underweight and low height, and he's very finicky.
Underweight and low height?
Yep. He's small overall. Yep. So she's obviously we've talked a little bit about ABA already, but are there any foods that you find can be particularly appealing to kids who sort of meet that profile when you're trying to transition them?
So again, it is so individual, but if it's low weight and low height, it might be just genetic, it might be a small family, or it might be a kid that's not growing well. So then are they not growing well because they're not absorbing their food because they have digestive issues, or are they just not eating enough to meet their needs? Those are two different things. If it's digestive, then obviously the family's going to want to work on healing the gut. If it's just picky eating, some of the things I look at are always zinc levels, because we know that zinc is related to appetite and taste perception. So if there is poor appetite and poor taste perception, kids are not going to want to eat that much. If we up their zinc levels, very often we can increase their appetite. The other thing that I tend to notice is that there are kids who have, because of low taste perception, they actually will eat more when we spice their food. And that is something that I don't think we do often enough. We tend to think kids want bland food. But I've seen a number of kids who do really, really well if you will squeeze lemon on their food, or put pepper or horseradish, or even gluten-free wasabi, but you have to be careful with that. Anything that's going to provide high-intensity flavor is something that should be tried in a kid who's picky, because it may be that they're just not tasting very much. I had a child who never ate vegetables until mom started putting cayenne pepper on them. And as soon as she started sprinkling cayenne pepper on them, he started eating a decent amount because he could finally taste something. I do go back again to texture and temperature, because those also can be really, really helpful for those kids who have a texture sensitivity. They may not want to eat because they don't like the way it feels. We want to make sure we can find the right texture of the food for them. So again, it might be ground meat versus a steak. It might be pureed vegetable versus raw versus cooked and soft. It could be something made, again, if the child likes a muffin, we want to take that muffin and we want to make it more nourishing than what he's typically eating by putting in some pumpkin or some butternut squash or some carrots or zucchini, throwing some of that in there so we can up the nutritional quality without necessarily totally switching it. And think again, if the child is still eating something like gluten or dairy, those are the things that I tend to find will tamp down a person's appetite for anything else. So if they're getting those two foods, they may not want anything else. And once you take them out, very often they'll eat more of other things.
Okay, great. One of the topics we want to be sure to talk about today is snacking. So let's touch on that one. I know there are different rules about how many times a day you should eat. what those different meals should look like. So maybe we could talk about that in the context of families who are dealing with autism. Portion size
Sure.
for snacks, I think, are a big part of it. And this person specifically is just asking for great ideas about what types of healthy snacks can you do on a GFCF diet.
Great. Snacking is a big issue, and we tend to think about meals as meals and snacks as something separate. And for kids, regardless of whether they're on the spectrum or not, this is kind of a standard, principle. Kids have small stomachs. They can't actually get enough nutrition into them unless every eating opportunity is one that's relatively healthy. So we do all our kids a disservice when we look at the chips and stuff and the candies and the, all that kind of stuff as snack, and it doesn't really matter. So I like to look at snacks as mini meals, and I like to use the same philosophy that I use for meals. So I'd like to see a protein. It could be nuts, could be nut butter, could be seeds, pumpkin seeds, sunflower seeds, could be a handful of nuts, could be, as I said, a nut butter or a pumpkin seed or sunflower seed butter. All of those are fine. I love to use hummus, black bean dip, black bean soup, roasted beans. Any of those make great snacks. Throw in, with your hummus, throw in some vegetables. With your black bean dip, the same. If you're doing something like nuts, some fruit goes in there really, really well. I love to throw coconut in there. It's got some really good fat. And for those kids who may be hungry a lot, increasing the fat is great. Avocado, guacamole, really great snack source. You can dip things in it. And again, there's nothing wrong with a few chips. You might want to use a bean chip. You can use a non-GMO corn chip. You can use, like I said, a vegetable chip or raw vegetables. Any of that stuff is great, but dip it in your guacamole. That's going to be a really great way to get good fat in there and some good calories. But I like those are kind of my go-tos. So from the other protein sources, animal protein, I tend to do something like beef jerky. That can be a really nice snack for somebody. Organic pepperoni slices or some rolled up turkey rolled up in some veggies. If you have shredded vegetables, like coleslaw or cabbage or shredded carrots, you can roll that up in the turkey around it and make little rolls, and those are great. Lara bars are another great option for kids who can tolerate, all the nuts and fruits that they contain. But any kind of energy ball that's a combination of nuts and fruit is a nice protein-rich, fiber-rich resource for a kid's diet. So those are some of my go-to snacks.
Okay, great. That's a great list. Textures are coming up a lot. So I'm getting a lot of questions about different textures. One mom has a loved one whose child, I think it's actually an adult, sorry. This person's an adult, doesn't want to use, they'll use a metal spoon or a plastic fork, but they won't use a metal fork. So things like that. This person's asking about the texture and temperature thing. Her daughter is autistic and tends to like sweets and crunchy things. Doesn't know which vegetables would work with that. So can you give some tips about textures and how you navigate those complicated issues?
So sweets and crunchy foods. So for sweets, obviously the more you eat of sweets, the more you crave them. So we want to kind of wean off the sweets. But, I do use things like stevia. I do use things like lohan or monk fruit. Those are all non-nutritive sweeteners that can be helpful in certain cases. So if you're trying to give her something that's a little sweeter, you might want to use some of those things, but each time you prepare the food, you want to kind of wean off and use a little bit less, a little bit less. I do like to use fruit as a sweetener because at least they get the fiber and they get some of the nutrients from that as opposed to just sugar. So throwing in one date into something can actually make it very sweet, but at least you get some of the nutrients from the date. But ultimately the goal with that is to kind of go down on the amount of sweetness that something has because the tongue will adapt and the taste will adapt. When it comes to crunchy, the other thing about sweetness, by the way, is cinnamon actually is really nice as a therapeutic herb, and it also tends to enhance the sweetness of things. So if you put some cinnamon in, you can usually cut down on some of the sugar. In terms of crunchy, again, fried chips, parsnip chips, carrot chips, and you can buy like a mini deep fryer and just slice your stuff up really thin, drop it in there, and make chips out of it. Salt them, that's crunchy, but it's a vegetable. If the crunchy If raw would work, that's great too. You know, a raw carrot or a raw piece of celery can be crunchy. Somebody can consider that crunchy. I love snap peas. They tend to have a sweetness to them. They are very crunchy, but they're also a good healthy vegetable. So that's something that I really love to offer. If you are looking for crunch and you don't want to cook, I mean, the other option is, again, I look at things like bean-based chips because sometimes those will give you a little crunch. The other thing I tend to do is think about the portion. So whereas we might normally give a child 10 or 15 chips, maybe we give them 5 chips, but we have other things in the snack. So we have some vegetables and then a few chips, and you try, you know, again, that maybe the chips can be dipped in salsa or in guacamole, or you just a bite of carrot, a bite of chip, and you try to reduce the amount as opposed to completely taking it away. But the first thing I do try to look at is how can I get the vegetables into a crunchy form? You know, people do make zucchini chips, things like that, kale chips. You know, you can buy kale chips now ready-made, and those are crunchy, and those can be really delicious. So looking at all of the vegetables you have and how you can dehydrate them and make them into chips. And you can buy a dehydrator, or you can buy dehydrated vegetables, and those are all more crunchy.
Okay. And any tips about pickiness about cutlery?
Cutlery. So I guess that's a good one, and I don't really have a lot of great answers. My question would be, aside from our concern with plastics, is there a reason why, I mean, in terms of choosing battles, I'm not sure that I would worry if my child only wanted to use a plastic fork. But it is interesting that they'll use a metal utensil for one thing and not the other. And I think I'd honestly need to know more about, I would need to explore that more. I would have a lot more questions about it because it's hard to figure out why they would use one and not the other. So I don't really have a lot of great answers.
Got it. It might be a behavioral issue. So I think that's
it might, yeah.
It could.
I think ultimately that's more what it probably is.
Right.
And so I would probably treat it more behaviorally.
Okay. So the next question is, this person's struggling with, they've got family members struggling with acid reflux. So she's asking about menus and diets, dietary choices that will not contribute to it. So what are some tips on that?
Well, when it comes to reflux, there's a lot of different things that can cause it. And while we hear that too much stomach acid is one of the triggers, very often in my practice I found that too little stomach acid is more the problem. If you don't have enough stomach acid, you will not trigger the whole digestive cascade of producing enzymes to start breaking down the foods and promoting their transit from the stomach to the intestine and out. So a lot of times, and again, these are all things that you have to be very careful with and you shouldn't really do without somebody guiding you, but I actually do a specific kind of a home test. It's called a baking soda test, but I look at that and it helps us to understand if the person has actually too much or too little stomach acid. And sometimes we actually need to add acid, and when we add the acid, a lot of the reflux symptoms go away. Probiotics and yeast are also linked to reflux, so again, going back to the underlying cause and figuring out if adding a probiotic is going to help. There are a lot of herbs that can be helpful, things like marshmallow and slippery elm, and there's a number of others that can be very soothing to the gastrointestinal system, and they can be helpful. So that's something to look at. When it comes to diet, what you're going to hear a lot of people say is avoid acid foods or avoid, you know, caffeine. I would assume most of our kids are not consuming. If adults are consuming it, yes, caffeine can be a problem. But I don't find that there's that much benefit to reducing acidic foods. And that doesn't really help. And what you really want to do is get to the underlying cause. You do want to be careful not to overfeed, because being overfull will also exacerbate reflux. Some people do find when the head of the bed is raised, they do better because it helps, gravity helps bring the food down. And not wearing a tight belt. So if we've got a kid who's wearing tight clothing or an adult who's wearing tight clothing, you really want to loosen that or it's going to exacerbate the reflux. But the first things I look at is gut function, both acid-wise and whether there's good bacteria in the gut. And I also look at whether using those medicinal herbs to try to calm what's happening.
Okay. This parent is asking about using a family-wide vegan diet. So would switching altogether to a vegan diet be beneficial to a kid on the spectrum? And I think they're mostly focusing on their loved one. But one added point, he says that the overweight child the child on the spectrum is overweight.
Okay. It's funny. I was just at a conference and I had a doctor ask me the same question about my feeling on vegan diets. And to be honest with you, I will support any family with any type of diet that they choose because I want to be respectful of their beliefs and their, inputs and make sure that I support them. But to be honest, I am not a huge fan of vegan diets, especially for kids on the spectrum. If we look at most of the therapeutic diets that we find beneficial, whether it be specific carbohydrate or GAPS or oxalate or modified Atkins, all of those are protein-based diets. And I do believe humans were given carnivorous teeth for a reason. So I actually tend to believe that some protein is good for us. But as I mentioned before, I think a plant-based diet is the most helpful for most people. One that's predominantly vegetables. It should be the biggest part of the plate, fruits, nuts, seeds, legumes, etc., with smaller amounts of animal protein. I think when you eat animal protein, you have to be extremely careful about the quality of the protein, that it should come from a clean animal and not from an animal that's full of antibiotics and hormones and other types of toxins. And I have no problem with somebody eating, limited amounts of animal protein. When it comes to a vegan diet for an entire family, you have to be very careful about B12, and we know how important B12 is for kids on the spectrum. We have to make sure that they are, have adequate levels of B12. We also know that iron is really important for cognitive function and IQ. That is harder to get on a vegan diet, so it's something the parents have to tend to very carefully. And they have to really think about, again, with small tummies, you can get very full on beans because they have a lot of fiber. So you want to make sure that the child is able to eat enough. Now again, with an overweight child, it's less of an issue, but you do want to make sure kids can eat enough to meet their nutritional requirements if they're not eating any concentrated form of protein like animal protein. And yes, it can come from nuts, but you want to also be careful about things like oxalates and how much of the nuts you're eating. So again, without knowing the full history and what specific diet the child needs, I couldn't give you an absolute answer, but on the whole, I tend to find that most vegan diets are very high in carbohydrate, and that is not ideal for our population.
Okay. So relating to diets, as you were just talking about, they're asking about ending the diet. So how do you know when it's time to go off the gluten-free, casein-free diet? And that would be both for the individual and family-wide.
Absolutely. There's no absolutes. I do usually recommend a minimum trial of somewhere between 3 to 6 months. So before that, unless it's something that the family is just absolutely unable to continue, I do think you should stick it out at least that long. I also think it's really important to keep data and make sure that you don't forget what it was like before, because I find that happens a lot. Parents will say, well, we really didn't see much benefit, it really wasn't that helpful, and then they go off it and they realize, wow, we just saw a big regression or we saw a big change and we didn't realize how good it was or how it did help. So important to, either whether it's every 2 weeks, every month. I think every 2 weeks is better, but take some data. Do some scoring and see what you're seeing in terms of change. And then be able to go back and look at that again if you're going to reintroduce. If you're going to reintroduce, I do recommend one thing at a time, not both, so either gluten or dairy. I recommend you do not a full force, all the foods are back in, but do a trial, and then wait a few weeks, giving a small amount to see if you notice any regression after you've done that, because sometimes it can take a week or two to change. So my recommendation is 6 months at a minimum, and then a trial of either gluten or dairy challenge, and lots of good data to monitor the reaction.
Okay, and one way that parents could do this if they have an ABA program, you could blind the therapist, or even your speech therapist, if you do weekly speech therapy or anything like that. You can blind them and not tell them that you changed the diet, and then see what do they say after the sessions. Is their data changing? That's a really good way
Absolutely.
to be objective about it and look at it. So as part of this,
the only thing you have to be careful with that, just one comment, if you're using any kind of reinforcers, then you want to make sure the therapist is not using reinforcers that violate the diet principles. So that's where sometimes it's hard to keep them blinded, because very often they're using reinforcers that aren't appropriate. So that's the one thing that you have to take into mind. You can just say, I'm going to provide my own reinforcers and this is them. And you don't have to explain why, but you want to make sure you've got that piece covered.
Okay. So this question's interesting. I think it's one a lot of families probably struggle with. So this is a mom who has a stepson who wants to initiate an autism diet, so a diet focused on GFCF or SCD or one of the other ones. But she says that both families aren't on board, so it would only be part-time. So is there still benefit if he follows it just part-time?
Unfortunately, it's never going to be as good as if you follow it full-time. We talk with families about the fact that even one small infraction may make it more difficult to see the effects or may mitigate the effects. So I would be lying if I said that it's fine just to do it half-time. But that being said, much of the benefit that we see from these diets has to do with reducing inflammation. And if the inflammation is reduced even half the time, if the child is on a diet or the boy is on a diet half the time, and he's then less inflamed, I can't imagine that it would hurt him. So I think that if he's willing and wanting to do it, then it's definitely worth it to try. The other thing is, if you see any obvious benefits, what if all of a sudden the bowels change, or all of a sudden there's like a notable change in behavior or function, then you can use that as a way to speak to the other half of the family about the benefits and use it as evidence and help. If you don't try it at all, then you'll never have that ammunition, you'll never have that data that says, look, when we're doing it in our house, this is what's happening, and we're seeing this and it's better. And when he goes back to the other house, some of those behaviors are either, coming back, going away, whatever, positive or negative. And so it may be good to have that information so that you can sell the diet to the rest of the family.
Okay. So we have time for just a couple more questions. I'm still getting lots. One of these questions relating to what you were just talking about is about how long gluten stays in the body. So I've heard that gluten can impact the body for up to 6 weeks after you eat it. So what is that
Right.
true? Is that a myth? How does that work?
We do know that you can see gluten remnants for weeks and weeks after. Whether it's exactly 6, we don't know. But yeah, it can last for weeks and weeks. So it takes a while, even after you've taken gluten out, sometimes to see those benefits. And remember that if you add it back in, you may be struggling with the blowback from that for a while as well.
Okay. We've talked about this quite a bit, but I think this parent is hoping to get some direct insight. She has a 28-year-old with autism who rejects everybody's efforts to support a healthy diet. He has osteopenia, wants only fast food, and his only, quote, vegetables are fries and ketchup.
Right.
So you're dealing with an adult with that sort of rigidity.
So that's tough. And there is far less you can do with an adult with that rigidity than with a child. But my question would remain, does he live independently? Is he living at home? If he's living at home, what food is being brought into the house? Because at least you can control that piece of it. The other thing is, are there any behavioral techniques you can use, any reward techniques to say, if you don't eat fast food, or if you don't eat, or if you do eat, this vegetable, then there is a reward of some sort. So using those behavioral techniques are important. I would also look, I don't know if he's going to a day program, I don't know if he's working, but depending on what other care he has outside the home, it would be helpful to get some of those people involved to see if there's his exposure to foods is less, so that there's not availability of the things that you're, not wanting him to eat. The less access he has is really going to be one of the best ways to mitigate what he is choosing. If he has access to, like I said, if he has access to a car and money of his own and he's buying his own food that way, it is definitely harder to control. But if you have control over those aspects, then you at least have the opportunity to mitigate some of it.
Okay.
And maybe you keep it as, maybe it's like a once a week, we go out and we do this fast food thing and we do it as a family and we celebrate it, but for the rest of the time, we don't eat that stuff. Maybe we have to not say you can't have it ever, but let's have more constraints and more schedule on when he gets it.
Okay. Here's a good question to end on. It's about how to find a reputable nutritionist to help advise their family on developing good meal plans. So how can someone go about finding a reputable person in their area?
So the term nutritionist is not licensed or regulated in any way. So anybody can call themselves one. Every parent listening here can call themselves a nutritionist if they'd like. That being said, it doesn't mean that every nutritionist is bad. I'm a registered dietitian. I find that in my field, we have some extensive training, but at the same time, much of it is very conservative and very conventional, as is the case with many physicians. So even though somebody is an RD, it may not mean that they're open or aware or knowledgeable about a lot of the special autism interventions. But at least you know that they've had a specific education. Certified Clinical Nutritionist, CCN, is another, I think, very reputable credential. They are trained in integrative nutrition, and it's a pretty rigorous program. So a CCN is somebody who would be advantageous. And when it comes to the RDs, you can go on the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics website. You can look for an RD in your area, and there is a special practice group of RDs called the Dietitians in Functional Medicine. Any one of those should be well-versed and competent in all of these types of diets and the approach that we tend to promote. So dietitians in functional medicine, functional nutrition are great. CCNs, I think, are very reputable. CNS, a certified nutrition specialist, is somebody else who has a master's degree and has taken a fairly rigorous exam. Those are probably the three credentials that I would be most comfortable with. Above and beyond that, somebody can be self-trained to be very good, or they may not be, and I really can't tell you. So there are the other nutrition credentials, or people who call themselves nutritionists. I really can't speak to the kind of education they've had. So CCNs, CNS, and dietitians in functional medicine are my go-to people for this type of work.